getaway. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the mountains as Captain Sonia Knox parked her car in front of the old, isolated cottage. The air was cool, crisp, and laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. She inhaled deeply, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders. A few feet away, Elena leaned against the car, her arms crossed, looking at the small stone structure, with a mixture of relief and weariness. "You sure this is the place?" Elena asked, running a hand through her dark hair, still tied back in the neat style she never quite let go of since leaving the army. Sonia nodded, pulling the keys from her pocket. "It's perfect. No one around for miles. Just us, the trees, and the silence." Elena offered a tight smile. "Silence. Sounds good right now." The breakup had hit Elena hard, and Sonia knew this trip wasn't just about getting away from the noise of their lives. It was about escaping the heartbreak that still lingered in Elena's eyes. "Come on, let's get inside and relax. I'll chop some wood for the fireplace," Sonia said, nudging her with her elbow. "You just get settled." Inside the cottage, the air was musty but comfortable. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and a stone hearth dominated one wall. Elena dropped her bag in the corner and sighed, sitting heavily on the worn couch. "This is nice," she said, more to herself than to Sonia. Sonia grinned and headed out the back door, where a small axe leaned against a chopping block. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, the rhythmic sound of the axe slicing through logs, filling the quiet forest. The physical exertion was meditative, her mind wandering back to her time in the army, then forward to the present, where she felt the weight of her friend's sadness more than her own stress. After several minutes, she spotted something strange among the pile of wood, a log, gnarled and twisted, unlike any she'd ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid, with what looked like knots forming the semblance of a face, the rough bark twisted around it like sinewy muscles, arms and legs, though it was small, maybe the size of a child. "What the hell?" she muttered, bending down to inspect it closer. It gave her a strange, almost eerie feeling. But then again, it was just a log, right? She shrugged and carried it back to the cottage with the rest of the wood, kicking the door open with her boot. "Hey, Elena," she called out with a grin. "I found you a new boyfriend." Elena looked up confused, until Sonia dumped the pile of wood on the floor with the strange log on top. "Meet Woody," Sonia said with a laugh, gesturing to the log. "No need for a real man when you've got this handsome fellow." Elena chuckled despite herself, shaking her head. "You're ridiculous." Sonia smirked and propped the log by the hearth, wiping her hands on her jeans. "All set. Fire's next on the list." They spent the evening by the fire, talking about old times, sharing wine and letting the warmth of the flames and the comfort of their friendship push away the shadows that had been creeping in. For a while, it was like nothing had changed. No heartbreak, no stress, just two friends in a quiet cottage, far from the world. As the fire dwindled to embers, they retired to their rooms. Elena fell asleep quickly, exhaustion overtaking her. Sonia, however, lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Something about that log still felt off, but it was just her imagination, she told herself, nothing more. With a sigh, she turned over, closing her eyes. Back in the living room, the fire's last ember glowed faintly, casting a weak, flickering light on the strange log propped up against the hearth. In the dim glow, the log shifted. The wood creaked softly, barely audible over the whisper of the wind outside. What had been still now bent, ever so slightly, as though stretching after a long sleep. Then it was still again. The morning sun broke, casting dappled light over the cottage. as Captain Sonia Knox and Elena sat on the porch with steaming cups of coffee. The air was fresh, a little chilly, but invigorating. "Do you ever think about Harris?" Sonia asked, looking out over the forest, her fingers drumming lightly on the side of her mug. Elena chuckled, raising an eyebrow. "CPT Harris." "Of course. I thought he was great. Real nice guy." Sonia laughed, shaking her head. "You thought he was nice? He was tough as nails on me. Constant drills, always pushing me harder than anyone else." "Really? Harris never gave me a hard time. Maybe he liked me better," Elena teased, flashing a grin. "Maybe he just knew you could handle it," Sonia replied with a smirk. "You were always the better shot. Deadly, really." "Too good, maybe," Elena muttered, her expression darkening for a moment before brightening again. "Anyway, enough about the past. You ready for that hike?" Sonia nodded. "Let's do it. We could use the exercise, and the view should be worth it." They gathered their gear and set off into the woods, the path winding through towering trees, the scent of pine and earth filling the air. As they trekked deeper into the forest, the silence was only broken by the occasional bird call and the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. "Feels good to get away from it all," Elena said, taking a deep breath. "No missions, no stress. Just us and the woods," Sonia agreed, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "It's been too long since I've had a break like this." They hiked for hours, enjoying the challenge of the terrain and the tranquility of the wilderness. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the canopy as they finally reached a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. They sat on a rock, catching their breath, sipping water, and enjoying the peaceful silence. "Beautiful," Elena said softly. "Yeah," Sonia replied. "Just what we needed." Meanwhile, back at the cottage, the strange log sat by the window. Its twisted, gnarled form seemed to shift slightly, the rough knots resembling a crude face angled toward the door. As the women hiked through the forest, the log adjusted itself ever so subtly, its knotted eyes focusing on the distant path through the trees. It watched. When Sonia and Elena returned to the cottage, the afternoon sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows over the clearing. They were sweaty and tired, but in high spirits. "That was great," Sonia said, stretching her arms over her head. "I needed that." Elena nodded, heading over to the woodpile. "I'll break some of this up for tonight's fire." Sonia leaned against the porch railing, watching as Elena grabbed the axe and began splitting logs. After a few strikes, Elena picked up the strange log they had laughed about the night before. "This thing is creepy," she muttered, setting it on the block. "Maybe it'll burn better than it looks," Sonia joked. Elena brought the axe down with a heavy swing, but the blade barely scratched the surface. She frowned and swung again, harder this time. The axe bit into the wood, but just as she yanked it free, a sharp pain shot through her hand. "Ow!" Elena hissed, dropping the axe and clutching her palm. Blood welled up from a deep cut across her hand. "Elena, you okay?" Sonia rushed over. Elena grimaced, holding up her hand as blood dripped down her wrist. "Yeah, I just nicked myself. Damn thing's tougher than it looks." Sonia glanced at the log, frowning as the blood seemed to disappear into the rough bark, the surface almost drinking it in. Did it just absorb your blood?" Elena shook her head, more focused on the injury. "Probably just soaked into the cracks. I'll clean this up." "You're so clumsy," Sonia teased, handing her a rag from the porch. Elena laughed, despite the pain. "Yeah, that's me. Only the thing I was ever good at was killing things." Sonia smirked. though there was a trace of something darker in her eyes. "Too good?" They both laughed, the tension from the moment passing as Elena bandaged her hand. The rest of the evening passed in a comfortable haze, the fire crackling in the hearth as they shared stories, reminiscing about their days in service and enjoying a few glasses of wine. The hours slipped by, the warmth of the fire lulling them into a sense of calm. Eventually, they fell asleep, their exhaustion from the hike catching up with them. The cottage was quiet, the fire's embers glowing faintly in the darkness, but something had changed. The log, still propped by the hearth, seemed different. Its gnarled form had a new energy, a subtle vibrancy. The blood that Elena had spilled earlier had soaked deep into the wood, giving it a kind of life, a force that hadn't been there before. In the stillness of the night, the log moved. First, a slight twitch of what could have been a limb, then more, a creaking, cracking sound as its wooden form shifted. Slowly it dragged itself across the floor, its knotted arms and legs moving with more fluidity than before, as though the lifeblood had awakened something deep within. It crept toward the door, limbs scraping softly against the floor, then disappeared into the dark forest beyond. The cottage was quiet once again, but something ancient and dark had stirred. The morning sunlight filtered through the cracks in the curtains as Elena groggily opened her eyes. Her head pounded with the dull ache of a hangover, and the smell of lingering smoke from the last night's fire hung in the air. Sonia was already awake, sitting at the edge of her bed, lacing up her boots. Elena groaned, pulling herself up. "Oh, why did we drink so much?" Sonia chuckled. "Because we're idiots. That's why." As Elena rubbed her temples, Sonia glanced toward the hearth, her brow furrowed. "Hey, where's Woody?" Sonia asked, looking around. "Did we burn him last night?" Elena, her head still heavy, shrugged. "I dunno. Guess that's another boyfriend gone. Easy come, easy go." They both burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the small cottage. It felt good to laugh, to let the tension slip away, if only for a moment. The day passed uneventfully. They spent the afternoon in the quiet rhythm of the forest, taking walks, making lunch, and falling into comfortable conversation. The woods around them were still and peaceful, the quiet that they had come here for wrapping around them like a blanket. As dusk began to creep in, Elena found herself sitting on the porch, lost in thought. The orange and purple hues of the setting sun stretched across the horizon, and the breeze whispered through the trees. She let the serenity of the moment calm her mind, but then something shifted. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Elena's gaze snapped up to the tree line, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. There, blending into the shadows of the branches, was a dark shape. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't belong in the trees. It was something else, something sinister. Her pulse quickened. "Sonia!" she called out, her voice shaky. Sonia appeared at the door within seconds, her sharp eyes scanning the trees. "What is it?" Elena pointed, but the shape was gone. The treetops swayed gently in the breeze, but nothing more. "I swear," Elena said, her voice quiet now. "I saw something. It was right there in the trees, looking back at me." Sonia glanced between Elena and the forest, her expression serious. "I've known you long enough, and we've been through way too much to think this is just a hallucination. If you saw something, it was there." Elena frowned, still shaken. "But it's gone now." "Wait here," Sonia said, her voice steady. She walked over to the car, her boots crunching on the gravel. Elena watched, still uneasy, as Sonia opened the trunk and pulled out a large black bag. She slung it over her shoulder and carried it back to the porch, dropping it at Elena's feet with a heavy thud. Elena looked down at the bag, then back at Sonia. "What's this?" Sonia unzipped the bag, revealing an assortment of firearms, blades, And ammunition. Guns, she said with a smirk. And a few other toys. Elena raised an eyebrow, despite herself. Always prepared, huh? Sonia shrugged. You know me. But seriously, how did I know this peaceful retreat would end in some kind of fight? Elena chuckled, though there was still tension in her eyes. No better meditation, right? Sonia smiled. Exactly. They both knelt down, sorting through the bag. Elena grabbed a sleek handgun, inspecting it with a practiced eye, while Sonia loaded a shotgun, the metallic clinks of bullets slipping into the chamber, breaking the quiet around them. Somebody's out there, playing games, Sonia said, her voice low and firm, and we're not going to let them. Elena looked out at the trees again, her mind racing. The feeling of being watched still clung to her, like invisible eyes just beyond the edge of her vision. We're going on a hunt, Sonia added, her tone resolute. Elena nodded, a cold determination settling in. She strapped a knife to her belt and picked up the gun, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Whatever was out there, whatever had stirred in the woods, it wasn't going to catch them off guard. Together, they stepped off the porch, their eyes scanning the darkening forest. The stillness that had been so comforting before now felt ominous, as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. They didn't know what they were up against, but they weren't about to wait and find out. The forest was silent as Elena and Captain Sonia Knox moved through the thick underbrush, their military training evident in their every step. Their movements were precise, deliberate, and soundless. Special forces skills honed over years of service. The shadows between the trees shifted as dusk deepened, casting an eerie light over the woods. Elena's eyes scanned the treetops, her fingers tight on the trigger of her handgun, adrenaline thrumming through her veins. The sight of that dark figure, looming in the branches, still gnawed at her. Sonia moved beside her, shotgun in hand, eyes sharp as a hawk's. They arrived at the spot where Elena had seen the shape, the branches high above swaying gently in the breeze. But there was nothing. No sign of movement, no lurking shadow. Nothing, Sonia muttered, her tone frustrated but steady. Elena's eyes swept the ground, searching for any clue, any sign. That's when she saw it. Drag marks in the dirt, faint but unmistakable. She knelt down, running her fingers along the disturbed soil. Something was dragged here, she said, her voice low. Sonia crouched beside her, frowning. Dragged? Elena's gaze followed the marks until they led to something strange. Splintered pieces of wood scattered across the ground. She stood, taking a few steps forward, and froze. Sonia, she said quietly, look at this. Sonia moved to her side, and her expression darkened. There, in front of them, lay the husk of a log, the very same one they had called Woody, but it wasn't intact anymore. It looked as though something had shed its skin, leaving behind an empty shell of twisted bark. The surface was split open, jagged edges like the remnants of a cocoon. It's like something came out of it, Elena whispered, disbelief lacing her words. Sonia shook her head, her jaw tight. This can't be real. This is only in horror movies and comics. Elena's mind was racing. She wanted to agree with Sonia, but something felt all too familiar. I don't know, Sonia. I've been having these dreams lately. They feel so real. Sonia glanced at her. Dreams? Elena nodded, her eyes distant. It's always me, you, Harris and a bunch of others. We're trapped in a makeshift base, in an apocalypse. Zombies, werewolves, the whole nightmare. And there's always this one person, dominant, always watching. He wears a chrome mask. Sonia's expression darkened. She looked at Elena for a long moment, then said, "Him. He's in my dreams too." Elena blinked. "What?" "But we'll deal with him later," Sonia said, gripping her shotgun tighter. "We've got this thing to handle first." Before Elena could respond, they heard a rustling in the bushes behind them. Instinct kicked in, and both women dropped into defensive stances, weapons at the ready, years of training taking over. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. Sonia's eyes darted to the tree line, and she stiffened. "There," she whispered, nodding toward the thick shadows between the trees. Elena followed her gaze and saw it. The shape, that same figure, dark, twisted, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was barely visible, blending into the branches, but its presence was undeniable. Sonia smiled grimly. "Take it out, Commander." Elena didn't hesitate. She raised her handgun and fired. Her aim was perfect, each bullet striking the target with precision honed from years of combat. The forest echoed with the crack of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. But the figure didn't fall. It moved, quickly, fluidly, disappearing deeper into the trees as though the bullets hadn't even touched it. Elena lowered her weapon, her breath coming faster. She looked at Sonia, worry flashing in her eyes. "That thing should have gone down." Sonia shook her head, her face grim. "We're gonna need a bigger gun." Elena looked at the bag they'd brought with them. "What else did you bring?" Sonia sighed. "Just the basics, but I've called in a favor." Elena raised an eyebrow. "How long until they get here?" Sonia checked her watch, then looked back at Elena with a smirk. "Soon." They stood in silence for a moment, their eyes on the tree line, the feeling of being hunted settling over them like a heavy fog. Whatever they were facing, it was unlike anything they'd ever trained for, and the night was only beginning. The forest had turned from a place of serene isolation into a labyrinth of shadow and fear. The fading light of day was now completely gone, replaced by the suffocating darkness of night. Elena and Sonia moved silently, their breathing steady, but the tension between them was palpable. The thing that had been in the trees was no longer just a distant shape. It was something far more terrifying, and it was hunting them. A sharp snap echoed through the trees, followed by a low growl that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "It's close," Sonia whispered, her voice barely audible. Elena's grip tightened on her weapon, her eyes scanning the dense woods. Every branch seemed to conceal a threat, every shadow a pair of watching eyes. Then it came. The creature lunged from the darkness, a blur of blackened limbs and twisted, grotesque features. It moved with an unnatural speed, too fast for something so large, and yet there it was, charging toward them. Elena fired a quick burst, bullets flying from her gun and ripping through the air. Sonia followed with a shotgun blast, the echo thunderous in the night. But it didn't stop. The creature barreled through the gunfire, as if it hadn't been touched, its body seemingly immune to the hail of bullets. Elena's heart raced, her mind screaming that this was impossible. She fired again, the gun kicking in her hands, but nothing seemed to slow it down. "Run!" Sonia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. They bolted, tearing through the underbrush as fast as their legs could carry them. The creature's snarls followed close behind, too close, its footfalls heavy and relentless. The sound of it, crashing through the trees, made the forest seem smaller, as if there was no escape from its monstrous pursuit. Elena's lungs burned with every breath, her legs aching as they pushed through the brush. They weren't going to make it. She could feel it. The creature was gaining on them, moving with terrifying speed, and worst of all, it didn't make a sound beyond the growls, its movements silent, like death itself chasing them. Branches whipped against their faces, roots threatened to trip them, but they ran on, desperate. The cottage loomed ahead, barely visible in the darkness, its silhouette a faint hope in the midst of their terror. "It's right behind us," Elena gasped, stealing a glance over her shoulder. The creature was there, just a few yards away, its grotesque form glistening in the moonlight. Its face, or what passed for one, was a mass of twisted wood and bark, its limbs long and unnaturally jointed. It looked like something born from the earth itself, but wrong, warped into something hostile, something evil. They reached the porch, practically throwing themselves inside the cottage. Sonia slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands, but they both knew that wouldn't stop whatever was out there. For a moment, there was silence, an unnatural stillness that made Elena's skin crawl. She turned to Sonia, her breath ragged. "What the hell is that thing?" Sonia shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, but it's not stopping." A loud crash shattered the silence. The creature slammed into the door, wood splintering beneath its weight. The hinges groaned, threatening to give way at any moment. Elena backed away, panic rising in her chest. "It's going to get in." Before the door could break, there was another crash, this time from the window. The creature's grotesque form crawled through the shattered glass, its twisted limbs pulling it inside with a speed that defied its size. "Stay back," Sonia shouted, firing point blank at the creature as it advanced. The shotgun blast hit it dead center, but the creature didn't falter. It kept coming, unfazed by the gunfire. Elena raised her weapon again, emptying the clip into the thing, her hand shaking with fear. Every shot landed perfectly, but it was useless. The creature moved closer, its unnatural eyes locked on them, unblinking. They were cornered now, backed against the wall of the cottage. The creature stood between them and the door, its jagged, wooden limbs twitching as it moved forward. There was nowhere left to run. "Sonia," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not stopping." "I know," Sonia replied, her face set in grim determination. She drew a combat knife from her belt and handed Elena another. "We'll have to get close." Elena swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she gripped the knife. "This is insane." "Just keep moving," Sonia said, her voice firm. "We'll make it through." The creature lunged, its claws outstretched. They both ducked, stabbing at it with their knives. The blades dug deep into its bark-like flesh, but no blood came, no response. It was like stabbing into stone. Elena slashed again and again, panic setting in. "It's not working," Sonia grunted as she drove her knife into the creature's chest, twisting the blade. "Nothing's working." The creature reared back, towering over them. Its arms swung down with brutal force, knocking the weapons from their hands and sending them crashing into the wall. Pain shot through Elena's side as she hit the floor, her vision swimming. It loomed above them now, its shadow casting them in darkness. It had them trapped, its monstrous form blocking any chance of escape. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she scrambled for something, anything to defend herself with. But it was too late. The creature bent down, its face inches from theirs, its eyes hollow and filled with a malevolent hunger. And then it moved closer. "Get out of there!" A voice boomed through the chaos, cutting through the fear like a knife. Elena and Sonia spun around to see Captain Harris standing just outside the tree line, holding a PSRL-1 rocket launcher on his shoulder. What the—" Elena gasped, glancing at Sonia. There was no time to think. The creature loomed over them, twitching in its monstrous way, momentarily distracted by Harris's arrival. "Run!" Sonia yelled, and without hesitation, the two bolted out of the cottage, their boots pounding against the dirt as they sprinted for cover. The creature turned its twisted face toward Captain Harris, just as Elena screamed, "Do it, Anthony!" With a calm precision honed from years in the field, Captain Harris aimed the rocket launcher and fired. The missile roared through the air, heading straight for the grotesque figure standing in the wreckage of the cottage. The explosion was deafening, the shockwave knocking Elena and Sonia off their feet as chunks of the creature flew in every direction, scattering like debris from a bomb blast. Fire and smoke billowed up from what remained of the cabin, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning wood. Elena blinked, struggling to her feet as the dust settled. Sonia stood beside her, coughing but unharmed. The two women turned to see Captain Harris walking toward them, a grin on his face. "Another day, another disaster," he said, his voice light, but his eyes scanning the area for any sign of more threats. Sonia smirked, brushing dirt off her jacket. "You always come through for us, Anthony." Captain Harris, as he was known to his team, shrugged. "It's what I do. But seriously, what the hell was that thing?" Elena, still catching her breath, shook her head. "I think it was Woody. You know, the log. We thought it was firewood." Harris raised an eyebrow, looking at the smoking remains of the creature. "Firewood? That's one hell of a cursed tree." "Something strange is happening here," Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. She glanced at Sonia. "Do you think it has something to do with the dreams?" Sonia's eyes narrowed. "It's possible. Whatever's going on, it's too bizarre to be a coincidence." Captain Harris frowned, his attention shifting between the two women. "Dreams." Sonia nodded, her expression serious. "Both of us. We've been having these vivid dreams. We're stuck in a base. The world's gone to hell, and we're fighting off vampires and zombies. But there's always this one guy. He wears a chrome mask. Every time he's there, watching us." Harris's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "A chrome mask? You've both seen him?" The two women exchanged glances and nodded. Captain Harris shook his head. "That's impossible. I've had the same dream. Same mask." "Who is he?" Sonia asked, her voice low, laced with suspicion and confusion. "I don't know," Harris replied, looking at the smouldering ruins of the cottage. "But this isn't just bad luck. These things don't just happen for no reason." As they stood there, the air still heavy with smoke and the fading glow of the explosion, Elena noticed something in the corner of her eye. The pieces of the creature, scattered across the forest floor, were moving. Her blood ran cold. Guys?" she said, her voice tight. Sonia and Harris turned to look, their eyes widening in disbelief. The pieces of the creature, some as small as twigs, began to twitch and shift. Roots snaked out from the shattered fragments, reaching into the soil as if they were draining energy from the earth itself. Slowly, the chunks of wood and bark began to regrow, knitting together, forming into new shapes. "No," Sonia breathed, watching in horror as the pieces started to rise one by one. First one, then another, then another. Before long, there were a dozen of them, a dozen twisted, monstrous figures, all identical, standing where the original had fallen. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, their gaze fixed on the three soldiers. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. "This can't be happening." "We're not dealing with just one anymore," Captain Harris muttered, his hand tightening on the grip of his rifle. Sonia swallowed hard, her mind racing. "We need more firepower." The creatures didn't move. They simply stood there, staring, their presence suffocating, their forms eerily still. And then, as if in unison, they took a step forward. "We've got to fall back," Elena whispered, but her voice wavered with the fear of knowing that retreat might not be enough this time. The hunt was far from over. "Don't suppose you brought a flamethrower?" Elena asked, her voice tense, as she glanced back at the creatures that loomed in the shadows, their eerie eyes following their every move. "Nope, sorry," Captain Harris replied, his grip tight on his rifle. "And we can't use the PSRL again. Blowing them up just seems to make more of them." Sonia nodded, scanning the area as they began to slowly retreat toward Anthony's truck, their weapons still trained on the creatures. "Let's fall back to the truck. It's not far." The creatures remained still, watching, their hollow, glowing eyes tracking every step the trio took. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sonia turned to Harris, her voice low. "Any chance you brought incendiary rockets for that thing?" She gestured to the PSRL slung over his shoulder. Anthony sighed, shaking his head. "No." "Guess I forgot, but I did spot an XL-18 at the base. Problem is, that's a 6-hour drive." As they talked, a low rumble echoed through the ground beneath them, like a tremor, shaking the earth itself. Elena's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Guys, do you feel that?" The creatures, which had been eerily still, began to move. Their steps were slow at first, but they grew larger, each one more grotesque than before. They were growing, mutating. Pieces of them split off, forming new creatures that moved with the same terrifying speed and silence. Elena's pulse quickened as the ground seemed to shift beneath them. "Let's get out of here!" she screamed. Anthony didn't need to be told twice. He bolted toward the truck, slamming the door as Sonia and Elena jumped in. He hit the gas, the engine roaring to life, tires kicking up dirt as they tried to peel away from the nightmare closing in on them. But it was too late. One of the creatures, now towering over the truck, reached out with a gnarled, twisted arm, its fingers, more like roots, grabbing hold of the vehicle. The truck screeched to a halt, its wheels spinning helplessly as the monstrous creature held it in place, its strength overpowering the engine. "We're stuck!" Anthony shouted, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. "They've got us!" Elena's heart raced as she looked out the window, the creatures closing in from all sides. There was no escape in the truck now. "We have to go on foot," Sonia called out, throwing open the door. "Move! Move!" They scrambled out of the truck, their weapons at the ready, but as they ran through the forest, the creatures followed. Their numbers were growing, pieces of the creatures breaking off, reforming into new, equally horrifying beings. The forest was alive with the sound of them, heavy footsteps, the creaking of their twisted limbs, the earth-shaking tremors as they advanced. They ran, but the creatures were relentless, their numbers multiplying with every step. Soon, there were over a dozen, then 2 dozen, the forest alive with these abominations. Elena's lungs burned as they sprinted through the trees, her legs heavy with exhaustion. "They're not stopping," she shouted over her shoulder. "There's too many." "Keep moving," Sonia barked, though her voice held a tremor of fear. But it was no use. The creatures were faster, stronger, and more of them were coming. Before long, the trio found themselves backed against a rocky outcrop, the creatures closing in from all sides, their twisted forms blocking any escape. There were over 20 of them now, each one larger, more terrifying than the last. Their glowing eyes bore into the 3 friends, and the air was thick with the stench of earth and decay. Elena's hands trembled as she gripped her gun. She knew it wouldn't work. They all knew. "This is it," Sonia said, her voice quiet. the weight of their situation sinking in. Captain Harris stood beside them, his jaw clenched. "We're not going down without a fight." Elena looked at them, her chest tight with fear and sadness. You are my only friends." Her voice cracked, the words hanging in the air like a final farewell. "It's been an honour." Sonia gave her a small, sad smile. "Likewise." Captain Harris said nothing, but his expression was grim, his eyes dark as he stared down the approaching creatures. The monsters inched closer, their grotesque forms casting long shadows in the moonlight. There was no escape, no chance. This was the end. End of part 1. Part 2 coming soon.